The sisters of Lazarus sent word to Jesus, saying, "Master, the one you love is ill." When Jesus heard this, he said, "This illness is not to end in death, but is for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was ill, he remained for 2 days in the place where he was. Then after this he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary sat at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise." Martha said, "I know he will rise in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus told her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I have come to believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one who is coming into the world." He became perturbed and deeply troubled and said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Sir, come and see." And Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not the one who opened the eyes of the blind man have done something so that this man would not have died?" So Jesus, perturbed again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay across it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the dead man's sister, said to him, "Lord, by now there will be a stench. He has been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus raised his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you for hearing me. I know that you always hear me. But because of the crowd here, I have said this, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he had said this, he cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, tied hand and foot with burial bands, and his face was wrapped in a cloth. So Jesus said to them, "Untie him and let him go." Now many of the Jews who had come to Mary and seen what he had done began to believe in him. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. The last I checked, the coronavirus website that keeps the numbers of cases and the numbers of fatalities, we have 28,723 people throughout the world who have died from the coronavirus that we know of. In the United States, there are 2,633 of those 28,000. The coronavirus has not avoided the clergy. I'm aware that it's at least 60 priests in Italy have died from the coronavirus. I just saw news that an American priest from Brooklyn, Father Ortiz, has died from the coronavirus. I know of a bishop in Ethiopia that has died from the coronavirus. I know there was several convents of religious sisters in Italy which were almost all entirely filled with people who had the sisters who had the coronavirus. In the midst of all of this death that is happening, our church's liturgy gives us this powerful story of Jesus raising a friend of his named Lazarus from the dead. So this raises a lot of questions for us. And as I did on the homily on the Annunciation, and as I discovered that I do a lot of times in my preaching, I want to first start with our human perspective and then try to empathize with and take on the perspective of Jesus. I think that is one thing that we can do in the midst of this coronavirus, and that these scriptures, especially this story about the raising of Lazarus, that could really give us meaning and a way forward and true hope at this time. So let's first start with this human perspective. When you just heard this story, Jesus is told that Lazarus, his friend, is dying. And Jesus responds, "This illness is not to end in death." Now, I'm going to stop right there. This illness is not to end in death. That's an interesting statement, because then Lazarus does die. The all-knowing Son of God, God the Son, Jesus Christ, said to the people, "This illness is not to end in death," and yet Lazarus still died. We could ask lots of questions about this. Did Jesus not know whether or not Lazarus was going to die? Did he intend to save Lazarus from the death? Why did he say this illness is not to end in death? Surely he knew that Lazarus was going to die, especially if our church is correct in saying that Jesus is 100% God and 100% man. So it's just an interesting question. Again, we're starting off with this human perspective. Then we hear, so when Jesus heard that Lazarus was ill, he remained for 2 days in the place where he was. He remained for 2 days in the place where he was. Back at the beginning of January, I went to the funeral, very sad funeral, of a cousin of mine who I grew up with. This cousin was somebody that I shared birthday parties with, because he was born, I think, April 24th or 25th, and my birthday is May 1st, so we always had our birthday parties together. And he died very tragically right before Christmas in 2019. One of the people who spoke at the funeral referred to this passage. And she talked about how the experience of Martha and Mary waiting for Jesus to come is similar to the experience of waiting for the ambulance to come. You call 911, and there you are at your house, not knowing what to do with your loved one who is in very serious critical condition, and you're waiting for the ambulance. And perhaps maybe that's what all of our feeling, especially as a society, especially as a worldwide community, a worldwide family, maybe that's the experience that we have right now, is it's kind of like waiting for the ambulance. We are waiting for help. Because the reality is we can't solve this problem on our own. And we're foolish to think that we can. This is what I like about Pope Francis, who yesterday did a special Urbi et Orbi address from the Vatican, did some Eucharistic adoration. He preached a homily. He preached about the story of the disciples in the boat with Jesus in the great storm, and Jesus being asleep there, and then the disciples going to Jesus, knowing they need help, and asking for the help. And this is what Pope Francis said. It's a very interesting thing that he said. Pope Francis says this: "Let us try to understand, in what does the lack of the disciples' faith consist, as contrasted with Jesus' trust? So as you recall, after the disciples came to him and asked for help, Jesus said, "Oh, you of little faith," or something to that effect. He was saying, "Do you not yet have faith?" He rebuked them for their lack of faith. And so Pope Francis is raising that. They had not stopped believing in him, so what is their faith then? They had not stopped believing in him. In fact, they called on him. They had enough faith to call out to Jesus for help. And as a world right now, it seems that at least Catholics, those who believe in God, we are calling out to God for help. And that's good. And that's important. And that's what we should do. So when Jesus says to them, he questions the level of their faith. They had enough faith to ask. But Jesus seems to imply they could have a greater faith. So let's look at that. But continuing on with what Pope Francis says. But we see how they call on him. And this is very important. We see how they call on Jesus. This is what they say: "Teacher, do you not care if we perish?" Teacher, do you not care if we perish? Do you not care? Pope Francis continues, they think that Jesus is not interested in them, does not care about them. One of the things that hurts us and our families most when we hear it said is, "Do you not care about me?" It is a phrase that wounds and unleashes storms in our hearts. It would have shaken Jesus too, because he, more than anyone else, cares about us. Indeed, once they have called on him, he saves his disciples from their discouragement. What I love about what Pope Francis is saying there is he's trying to empathize with Jesus' perspective in this situation. When somebody asks him, "Do you not care about me?" In some ways, it seems like a legitimate standpoint from our human perspective, but if we look at it from Jesus' perspective, does it hurt him if we ask, "Do you not care about us?" Even as we are waiting for the ambulance to arrive. And that is a good question. Why did Jesus wait for 2 days? We hear it later said in this gospel. Could not the one who had opened the eyes of the blind man have done something so that this man would not have died? That seems like a very legitimate question. Jesus, we heard last Sunday, cured the man who had been blind from birth. He was able to do that. These people raised the very human question, could not Jesus have done something so that Lazarus would not have died? Why didn't he do it? Why did he wait 2 days to go out and see Lazarus? What was he waiting for? And after all, he said at the beginning, this illness is not to end in death. And yet Lazarus did die. Trying to empathize with Jesus, we can see his emotion come out. He became perturbed and deeply troubled and said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Sir, come and see." And Jesus wept. Perhaps the shortest verse in the entire scripture. Jesus wept. It doesn't say why he wept. And from a human standpoint, obviously, he lost a very close friend of his, Lazarus. But I wonder if he was weeping over the death of Lazarus, or if there were other things on Jesus' mind. As we try to empathize with Jesus, as we try to get into his perspective a little bit. The one who, as I mentioned on the Feast of the Annunciation, the one who chose to leave the comfort of heaven to come down to be with us in the midst of this world where there is pain and where there is suffering. Why was Jesus weeping here? Because clearly it couldn't have only been because Lazarus had died. Because he knew very well that he had the power to raise Lazarus. In fact, that's what he does right after this. He raises Lazarus from the dead. I don't believe that's why he wept here. If we try to empathize with Jesus and try to look at his perspective. Because one of the things is started off talking about all the death that is happening from the coronavirus. One of the things we learned in the scripture is that Jesus has a different way of looking at death. So when he said at the beginning, this illness is not to end in death, and yet Lazarus still died, what we hear later is that Jesus doesn't look at death the way that we look at death. He doesn't see it the way we see it. He doesn't define those terms the way that we define the term death. He looks at death as sleep. That's one of the things he said to his disciples. He said, Lazarus is asleep, and I am going to go and awaken him. I don't think those verses were here in this part because I read the shorter version. And then the disciples are like, well, if he's just asleep, then he'll be saved. And Jesus had to say, no, he died. Because now he has to translate it into the human perspective, the purely human perspective. No, he died, but I'm going to raise him. So Jesus doesn't look at death the way that we look at it. In this case, he says that the dying of Lazarus, the purpose of it, he says at the beginning, this illness is not to end in death, but is for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. This particular death of Lazarus is for the glory of God in his resurrection, Jesus raising him from the dead, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Those are interesting words. What does he mean, the Son of God will be glorified through it? We might think, well, part of it is that he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and then everyone's going to believe in him, and he's going to be loved and extolled, and everyone's going to worship him, everyone's going to come to him. But the context doesn't tell us that. When Jesus talks about glory in the Gospel of John, he's not really necessarily talking about having a good reputation. Because one of the things in this passage of the book of John, this is in John chapter 11, the first half of the book of John is called the book of signs. The second half of the book of the Gospel of John is called the book of glory. And this particular event, the raising of Lazarus from the dead, is the climax of the book of signs. It is the climax of the book of signs. Because once Lazarus is raised from the dead by Jesus Christ, it is right after that. If you read the passage right after this, you continue on reading in John 11. It is right after that there is a Sanhedrin that is gathered, and the chief priests. And they're very concerned because Jesus is getting more popular, and now this is the trigger point for them to find a way to execute Jesus, is the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Not noticing the incredible miraculous nature of this, or at least not giving into it and not attaching themselves to it, the establishment, the chief priests, the Sanhedrin, they want to execute Jesus for raising somebody from the dead. That important detail is important also to see this entire passage, this entire event in its contexts. Maybe the reason Jesus waited around 2 days before he went is because he knew that raising his friend Lazarus from the dead was going to trigger people to start planning and plotting to kill him. And maybe in his humanness, he needed a couple days to get ready for that. Because all of these events in the Gospels, they're all tied and linked together. They're not just done in isolation. The way we read them at Mass, we read one story here, one story there. Sometimes we have to remember that's part of a larger story. It's all tied together. And when we see the entire story, we can start to empathize with Jesus. When he says this illness is not to end in death, what he means perhaps is that the illness of Lazarus will not bring him eternal death, will not send him to hell, even if he does physically die. And maybe what he also means is that we may physically die, but even if we die, we also believe, as we say in the Creed, I believe in the resurrection of the body and life everlasting. And that resurrection we know will happen one day. Jesus asked Martha and Mary, and they believed. They said, we know that it'll happen. We know the resurrection will happen. And Martha said, well, yeah, I know it's going to happen on the last day. And Jesus had to say, in this instance, I'm going to raise Lazarus sooner than on the last day. Of course, later Lazarus will die again, and he will experience another resurrection when the final resurrection comes. So more and more, friends, let's understand the perspective of Jesus. That question, could not the one who opened the eyes of the blind man have done something so that this man would not have died? There's a lack of trust there. There's a lack of awareness. And Jesus asks us to trust him the way that Martha and Mary did. That's the invitation. So in the midst of all of this death with the coronavirus, we are in that position basically where we're waiting for the ambulance to arrive. And one of the things that frustrates us perhaps is God's timing, that the ambulance hasn't arrived already. For us, it's 3 or 4 weeks too late already. It seems like Jesus is just hanging around like he was here. He hung around for 2 days. What's Jesus waiting for? That's all a very human perspective, and there's nothing wrong with that. But my friends, if you take scriptures like this and open them and let the Lord speak to you through them, reading about the story of Lazarus, reading like Pope Francis did about the story of the boat, the disciples in the boat and the storm of the sea, we will get more insight into a real way of thinking that gives us more empathy for Jesus, to get his perspective, to see the real perspective, to see what's really going on, that there is a purpose behind this. So as we wait for the ambulance to arrive, the divine ambulance, let us know and put our faith in the belief in the resurrection of the body. Lazarus was raised from the dead. Jesus Christ rose from the dead, and so will all of us in God's timing.